Well, Paul, here is the La pensée et le mouvant, Henri Bergson. And in this volume, Bergson discusses, among many other things, an author whose name is Monsieur Ravissant. And Monsieur Ravissant speaks about the teaching of drawing, and he emphasized
he tried or did reform the teaching of drawing in France at one point.
Yeah.
Around 1850 or something like that.
63, apparently. Okay.
Yeah.
So he's objecting to the standard way of approaching drawing in France at the time.
Yeah.
And it's essentially the way he describes it. It's a mechanical approach to drawing. This is an objection that, in essence, mutatis mutandis, Bergson raises against just about all of modernity. And the problem here is that you're approaching drawing, or in fact, the subject of drawing, subject matter, from the outside. And so you're starting mechanically you learn simple geometrical forms, and you go towards the more complex ones, first the straight line, then the triangle, the rectangles, he says, the squares, and so forth. And finally, the circle. And then from there, you will build towards, on the basis of these geometrical forms, you will come to learn how to draw human figures and so forth. And he says, well, the only thing you'll learn how to draw by drawing these geometrical figures is more geometrical figures, which is to miss the point, because for him, the key here is to regain access to the movement proper to the form to be drawn, le mouvement propre de la forme à dessiner. And this is what the contemporaries fail to address, l'esprit de la forme. So it is the spirit of the form.
Yeah.
And
yeah, but
no?
I just want to mention that in that passage, Ravissant was working with a commission or a group of advisors that included Delacroix.
Fine. All right.
To implement this, I guess it was a reform for grade school and high school drawing instruction.
All right. But
I think that's what it was.
Okay, but whether it was that or not, the argument stands.
And, right. I mean, it's interesting that in the 19th century, in French schools, and this was even true in the 90s in France, everybody had a drawing course. Everybody was learning drawing. In the 90s, I knew something about it because I knew some kids in France. And at that point, the drawing teaching had become completely debilitated. It was completely worthless and ridiculous, except insofar as it forced kids to do a little bit of so-called drawing. But there was no actual instruction anymore.
Yeah.
But it's just, in other words, that's a tradition that was very strongly in place that's now completely gone. It's just a side.
Demolished. It has been completely demolished.
Yeah.
Sure. Les arts plastiques, now they call it. And they include anything that is manual.
Right. It doesn't mean anything anymore. There's no, I'll just mention, since we're mentioning that, in the 60s at the Beaux-Arts, the great art academy founded in the 17th century in France that produced so much. In the 60s, drawing was thrown out. It was proclaimed bourgeois, and it was thrown out. And it was brought back in the 90s. And it was controversial when they brought it back. And I remember listening to debates on France Culture about bringing it back. And I realized that what they were bringing back was not really drawing. I mean, it was just people, they were making lines on paper and drawing stuff and going out and drawing stuff, but there was no actual drawing instruction involved. So, they were just bringing back the word and something that vaguely resembled something, but it was not anything, like drawing instruction.
I myself don't really care much for instruction as much as education. So what?
Well, call it what you like.
Yeah, but education, in other words, raising the child to
Well,
the
I mean, there have been
fill a
there have
task.
been famous schools that have produced fabulous draftsmen, and other schools which have not. There's movements in painting that include, it's mostly done through the influence of practice of artists on younger artists. But there were times when there were approaches to drawing that were very successful, and a lot of people learned how to draw very well. And that's been long gone.
Well, we have great flow of advertisement to compensate for that.
It makes all the difference.
Come on. It has special effects that you would never.
What?
They have special effects that you would have never fathomed in earlier times.
Right.
Or as
Makes up for it.
put it in my, I once, well, I'll just give you an anecdote. I was once in a course called Computer Art.
Yeah.
Many a moon ago, and
Yeah.
one of these students who was just utterly unfamiliar with anything prior to his own times.
Yeah.
I exposed him to, I think, a reproduction of a painting from the Renaissance, and he told me, "Yes, okay, but you see what I have on the screen. Michelangelo would have never been able to do this because he threw in an equation, and the computer produced all kinds of lines
Right.
based on that equation. And Michelangelo could have never, as a draftsman, could have never produced such a thing. It's such,
Yeah.
such
And never would have wanted to either.
Yeah, no,
And nobody ever would have wanted him to.
no, he would have been jealous. He would have, no, this was just he would have covered it up. It was just that he couldn't. He wasn't able to. And then he would have said, no, just like you're not able to do it. And you're telling me that you wouldn't want to, but in reality, those are the sour grapes and the fox, that's obscene. That's obscene. But
it's part of the fake reality we're living in. They invent desires. They invent, importance. They just,
Okay. Everything is very self-serving. But now he goes on, Bergson, and he emphasizes another point of it. So the mechanical, what is his objection to the mechanical, is that it reduces the spiritual to the mechanical. So it reads the spiritual in function of the mechanical. C'est bien plutôt la vie qui donnerait la clé du monde inorganisé. So he goes, cette métaphysique est impliquée, etc., etc. The point is that it's the spiritual that is the key to the world that is not organized, and also to the material world. So there's something inherent for Bergson, certainly in all nature, in all even material, so-called material movement and appearances and phenomena that is of a spiritual nature. Cette beauté va d'ailleurs en s'accentuant à mesure que la nature s'élève de l'inorganique à l'organisé, de la plante à l'animal, de l'animal à l'homme. So nature has a hierarchy that goes all the way up to man. And the key here is, I think, is to represent somehow, to register. He says, la forme n'est que du mouvement enregistré. So I would say that the the painter, the drawer, is there to give an image of that movement, of this inner movement of things. No? He goes on and says, toute chose manifeste dans le mouvement que sa forme enregistre la générosité infinie d'un principe qui se donne. So what are you registering? You're registering, right, in your form, the infinite generosity of a principle that gives itself. That's in his terms. Now, this was in a volume, it's a collection of essays, of papers entitled La pensée et le mouvant, thought and, well, okay. Now, the subject that I proposed to discuss was poetry and painting. Insofar as the relation between the two poles also has a bearing on the problem of technique. Now, how do you approach painting? There may be objections that I would raise to Bergson's position, but I find it helpful. I find it precious, of importance, when it comes to objecting to a tendency to approach everything we do from the outside of its target. So I'm approaching something that is out there, and now the problem becomes one of bridging the gap between my position and the object. Mm-hmm. Of course, you could say, that people as Husserl objected to that and sought a standpoint that was inherent in things, as opposed to being something that is trying to reach things from without. Yeah? Now, the problem of technique, as far as I can see, is today inextricable from this modern problem, the problem of the agent and the world. How do you bridge the gap between the two? How do they relate? We need a methodology. We need a method.
The agent? What do you mean the agent?
The painter, for example, right? The thinker, à la Descartes. How do we bridge the gap between? Obviously, you need a method. They will say, you will need a method to bridge that method. Of course, the term itself tells you.
A method to do what? To
bridge the gap.
To bridge the gap to what? To what end? To represent what you see, or to express what?
Okay, in painting, whatever the end is, because it is not always clear what this end is. Yeah, and modernity has a hard time defining ends, or if not defining, in any case, opening itself up to the problem of hierarchy, the problem of ends. It is, as I once pointed out, modern man is very good at fighting for freedom, but then once he has freedom, he has a hard time,
doing something decent with it.
Yeah, he doesn't know what to do with it. So defending it also. He doesn't, he has a hard time defending. He's not very good at fighting to defend.
Because he can't justify it, because he's not doing anything decent with it.
Yeah. So, well, but who is to say what is decent, what is indecent? So
Exactly.
problem of standards, but this problem of standards, problem of ends. And I've insisted in various quarters that it seems to me obvious, but anyway, I've insisted that the problem of ends is to be the guiding problem, and the concern for ends, the thought about ends is to be the guiding thought, the guiding concern. And from it, somehow, we will derive the problem of means, and in the light of the problem of ends. Now, Bergson, I think it is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just say that
Yeah.
the modern idea of acquiring technique or acquiring a method, and that opens you up to the possibility of doing whatever, it's incoherent.
Or it's sophistry.
Yeah,
In
so
Plato's sense.
so obviously the means have to be about the ends.
Now, of course, this is related to the abolition of natural ends. So there's no natural hierarchy
Right.
of ends, because
Right.
then you end up saying, well, it depends, whatever you want to do. You know,
Right.
it's an end that you
Right, that you
conceive on your
choose.
own, atomistically, gratuitously, ad hoc, and so forth.
Right.
So relative.
And thus exploding the definition of the arts, in other words, the nature of the arts, because the arts actually have a nature. And so if you get rid of the nature of the arts, so then the ends are chosen by the artist, and it goes in absolutely any direction, and each artist is in his own world, his own metaphysical world, and so the whole thing becomes nonsense and incoherent. And you can no longer talk about, say, painting or poetry, because each painter or poetry is this ultimate existential hero who's generating his own reality and his own criteria of good and evil, and his own so
Well, the challenge, of course, is, well, then is to come out of this situation. And how do you? Now, when we say that there's no natural hierarchy of ends, we mean that the ends are not given in advance. That they somehow evolve through our own work, through our interaction with them, or they're a result of a production, right? They're the end of a kind of a work. They're not given in advance, and the fact that they're not given in advance is taken to mean that we're free. So ends given in advance are an imposition, or understood to be an imposition. Now, I think Bergson's answer would be that there's something to be discovered in the movement of things, and that the end is not something given literally, but something to be rediscovered all the time, as it were. And in any case, it has to do with the inner life of things. The emphasis on the inner life of things is crucial, is what can be retained from Bergson in a positive way, against this this habit that has become progressively accentuated in the modern world of looking at things, in fact, we could say fetishistically, yeah, as sort of things that have no inherent value or importance or meaning.
Yeah, in the experience, what happens in art school now is that they retain something of the old format, but so these students will present their work, and then the student will be asked, well, what are you trying to accomplish? Because we can't say anything about what you're doing unless we know what your goals are, and then we can guide you in terms of what your goals are. And I had that experience, I don't know how many times.
We'll give you the
That
tools.
already, what?
They give you the tools to empower you to achieve
Well,
your goals.
they're not even tools. They're going, the first thing is you have to say what your goals are.
Right.
And then because otherwise any critique, any idea or guidance or anything is completely meaningless, because it can only have meaning in the context of your goals, and each student, each artist has their own goals. And that by the 1970s, and this is starting to be 50 years ago, a half century ago, this had completely taken over art schools. I went to 4 different art schools, and this is what was going on. I mean, it wasn't total complete everywhere, but in some places it had completely taken over, and eventually it swept everything aside. So that's a practical example of where it leads. Each student is encouraged, is told nothing about what the ends of painting might be. Nobody ever says, look, that's not working at all. That's, this is completely ridiculous what you're doing. What you need to do is this. That never happened. Well, it did in the Hoffman School. There were still Hoffman students who were talking like that, even though they weren't responsible teachers. But so there was, anyway, to give a practical example of what we're talking about.
Right. But this is just one instance of what happens, I think, in all disciplines at this point. And even in the hard sciences, you end up in a comparable.
Yeah, the idea of feminist mathematics or something, which they tried those things out. And that's the guiding idea, that somehow either individuals or groups or there are these different metaphysical realities which are somehow coexisting. It doesn't make any sense.
You took an extreme case.
Except it's a real case.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It's hard to swallow, but yes.
Well, it's hard to imagine that such a thing was proposed, but it was.
No.
In the 80s, there was this whole thing about, it's obviously ridiculous, but it existed.
Well, but once you start speaking, of course, of feminist mathematics, you can go on and speak about any kind of gender mathematics, and so
or race. There's
racial,
black.
Of course, they've started that recently, I believe. So but now one thing I think to emphasize is, can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, because your video is stopped. But one thing to realize here is that this situation, which on the face of things is relativistic, cannot stand on its own, and that this relativization of all disciplines, we could also speak about it in terms of compartmentalization, disintegration, in the sense that you lose unity, is then serving the constitution of a new unity, for everything falls under the jurisdiction of a new authority. So there is going to be a market now, a market that so this relativistic stage, of course, is setting itself up to be conquered. It is a stage for the intervention of a unifying principle. So, divide et impera, you could say, yeah, it is pretty much the same logic. Everything is being destroyed. There's this atomistic society. and the atomism that pervades all disciplines, and even without going into the wildest compartmentalization of mathematics, one of which you mentioned, you have just the specialization that is breaking down into the branches that are spreading out. And this ad infinitum in principle, it could go on and on as in fractals. But whatever the case may be here in terms of details, this breaking down and loss of unity of the integral is setting the stage for the intervention of a Deus.
And that other thing will be?
Yeah, well, it's not going to be the old form of authority. It's going to be a new form of authority that is an entirely mercenary one. So in our present scenario, it's going to be the market. The market rules. If you're a chemist, a biochemist, whatever you are, you're working in a lab, who is determining what you're going to be doing in the lab? It's going to be the market, whatever is marketable. And of course, the results that you come up with when you do tests to show if a machine works or not, if a kit works or not, if a virus detection kit works or not, this all has to match criteria that are determined by the market. Time limitations, you have to meet the schedule, never mind whether it's a good result, if it's fake or not. It has to meet the schedule. It has to meet the expectation.
Why the market, not something else?
Oh, it's the market. If you go work for a major corporation as a biochemist and you work in a team, who is going to be the director of the research? Well, maybe a biochemist, fine, but whom is he working under?
Oh, okay, but where does that leave, say, someone who has the idea they want to be an artist or a painter or a poet or something?
Well, it's the same thing. You have a market that determines. He can be on his own. It's just as a biochemist, he can work in his own little lab in the middle of nowhere, but nobody's going to finance him. Nobody's going to sponsor him, and nobody wants to even bother welcoming his work because it doesn't fit a market.
But okay, I get it. But what what's going on now in art is that it's completely atomized, and there doesn't seem in art to be any kind of organizing principle beyond this, what I would call religious fanaticism about each artist being a generator of his own metaphysical reality. So how would this unifying force apply to poetry or painting?
All right. First of all, when they're just flattering the so-called painters, they're which is the artiste. They're flattering them.
Yeah.
Flatter them into believing that they're free, they can express themselves and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Determine their own ends. As they flatter them, they are telling them, and essentially, you're in your little corner, and this corner is within or on the stage that is controlled by the market. You have no say about what is beyond your little corner. You're free.
Promotion becomes the ultimate arbiter. And promotion is ultimately about the market. Yeah. Okay.
Well, they're déracinés. They have uprooted the painter from something fundamental, from anything fundamental and permanent. And so, he's just a leaf in the wind. And guess what comes along, as in a scene of Dante's Inferno, there's this, people are like dead leaves scattered around in this sort of a cyclone, all right? So the wind comes and picks them all up. These are people who are like dead leaves and does whatever it wants with them.
So the question then becomes, first of all, what is in reality the true nature of these arts, and then how do we get back to that, right?
All right. Well, first of all, what is the alternative? Certainly we can study the classics to recover a sense of an alternative. But now what seems to me to be crucial is the problem of the human being. And so what is needed, and it just so happens that we both need it and we want it by nature, is what we could call a philosophical anthropology, namely an understanding of the human being that is well rooted in permanent features of reality. Only in the light of such an anthropology, which deserves being called a philosophical anthropology, that is, by the way, capable of responding in a significant and decisive way to alternative anthropologies, such as the anthropology presented and articulated by Martin Heidegger. Only thanks to such an anthropology could we defend and recover.
Right, but wouldn't that anthropology be equivalent to the pre-modern anthropology?
It may very well be, but that would need to be rediscovered. Then again, we have competing ones. Pre-modern is not enough to say pre-modern, but shall we? So we could speak, for example, of that element of the pre-modern that is rejected by the modern. And that element has been, I think, justifiably defined as Platonic. It is the Platonic element of the pre-modern that is twisted, perverted, and finally rejected.
Okay, but so there are different versions. There are different pre-modern versions, but would any one of those be better than what we have now, or is there only one anthropology?
Well, what I just said was that our safest bet is to try to figure out what specifically was rejected, attacked even, and finally, even today, condemned by modernity as it looks back upon the classics.
That then those elements would then be part of the true anthropology.
Well, they would be part of the alternative.
Okay, so, but I just like to clear up this one point. Is it imaginable that there are differing anthropologies that would be better than what we've got now, or is it always just one true anthropology, more or less slightly distorted?
Well, look, I wouldn't want to lose the forest for the trees. There is the most general, shall we put the most comprehensive vision that is rejected as a fundamental alternative. Is there a fundamental stance? Fundamental. So that there's no question of different variations at this stage. Sure, then you can have variations. One thing is that we could say that is fundamental is that there has been a rejection of the goodness of origins. The beginning is bad. It has to evolve. It's insufficient. It's falling short of completeness for the moderns. This notion.
Except you okay, but you already get a little of that, say, in Thucydides, who, the Peloponnesian War is superior to all previous wars, that kind of thing. So it's not quite so simple as is that, I mean,
Okay, but that's a specific. How do you say that it's superior? How on what grounds will you say that it's superior?
well, Thucydides said because there were more people involved, because the issues were greater, the geographic area was greater.
Yeah, but greater implies best, and the best is given by nature. Okay.
Well, okay, I mean,
There is no sense in
I'm just saying that
the development of a global society.
the philosophical tradition in itself begins to question certain origins. It's not necessarily a completely radical questioning of them, but philosophy itself, I mean, it's not like you can just say, okay, origins.
No, it's really, look.
Depends what depends exactly what you mean, because these terms are very, very large.
Pre-Socratics, not that hard. I mean, pre-Socratics would consider origins not as the good, because you cannot say that what they could say, that fire, primordial fire, is good. You might have the good and the bad too, the two elements that are conflicting. You might have even an agnostic. This is a very vague term again, but you might have you have all kinds of visions of origins where you have a conflict at the beginning. However, if there is something good, and certainly everything in our life and discourse presupposes it, that is not something ultimately to be achieved by man ex nihilo, or in any case, something that is going to be unprecedented ultimately. But if there is the good, that is something that is hidden, that can be recovered. You turn back to that. Even the most materialist, Epicurus, Democritus, they're looking back at something that is given, that is hidden.
But don't you mean by origins? Don't you mean the nature of things?
Appearance,
the timeless nature of things.
It ends up being an identical problem, but here I'm referring to home ground. Where do we take our bearings from? Ultimately, how do we orient our lives? Where do we turn to? Do we turn towards the future? Towards the past, romantically, you could say, but then the past on its own doesn't stand. To the origins of the past. I mean, if we just say we're just in the present, that's tantamount to saying that we're just atoms ready to be picked up by the market. So, is there something of the utmost importance to be recovered as the beginning of all that is going on? Something that does not require for us to make it, to produce it, to enhance it, even to enhance it.
But is that really about time, or is that not just about what things are?
When I speak in temporal terms, that's it's a conventional way of looking at things, but a provisional way of looking at things. Nevertheless, this becomes especially important when it's a matter of confronting ourselves with the modern orientation, right? Because the element of eternity is thrown out of the window. So the question of
right, but here we are. We're a human being, and in fact, our fundamental situation is as if we were living in Greece in the 7th century BC. because we have eyes, we have ears, we're bipedal, we have opposable thumbs, so on. So there's something just basic about our situation, quite apart from the societies that come and go. There's something about simply being a human being that's just there. You're talking about anthropology, the right
Yeah,
anthropology.
I don't know why you chose the minimum common denominator, but
Well, I mean, that's a starting point anyway. I
no,
mean,
for me, it's not a starting point, because I could have 3 legs, I could have 5 eyes and 2 noses and so forth and so on, and still be human.
well, yes, that's another aspect of you're talking about another aspect of humanity. But
Not just an aspect, but something more fundamental, something more proper.
well, okay, it's you're talking about the human soul, and so that applies also. I mean, here we are with our human souls, and there are human souls all over the globe, and there have been through all of time, and I mean, in other words, there are these fundamentals that are there.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, isn't that what we're talking about? If you're talking about an anthropology,
Yes.
anthropology, a study of what man is.
Yeah, but what man is not a question, is not a problem that you can solve without reference to fundamental features of reality.
Which are also always there.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I
So
mean,
in other words,
the human being is not something static. The point is that it's not something static, that the human being has to do with what the human being is, has to do with ends. So to understand what the human being is,
well, I mean, that's like Aristotle. Aristotle would say that a human being is part of what a human being is are his natural ends.
ultimately what he is, it has to do with the human being, has to do with well, the human being is a telos. He has to be understood as a telos. And this telos obviously is at once a path and an end. So this end, however, of the human being, the perfection of the human being, is not to be understood autonomously, but it is to be understood in terms of perfection simpliciter in itself. What is perfection itself? Not just the perfection of the human being. Again, when somebody as Dante addresses the question of man, he speaks about classical terms, about the double end of man. So man has 2 ends, and you cannot understand either autonomously of the other. So there is a political
You
end.
have to burn the candle at both ends.
There's a political end, and then there's the end that is testified to by religion. So the monarch or the prince, so the political hero par excellence, represents our human end, but this human end is open, essentially open. Not because, at some point it'll be open. To be itself, it has to be. And it is defined by this openness to this other ultimate end. Ethics is that opening that is properly human to what we could call the metaphysical. I mean, but again, there's a political metaphysics too. So the ultimate, and again, the ultimate is to be understood also with respect to to the political. So there's
To
this
the what? To the
political, to the political, to the ethical. So to the ethics dimension. So there's the human being is, as it were, defined by these two poles that are inextricable ultimately. Now you will find this, of course, in the echoes of this, strong and even imperial echoes of this in Christian theology. So there is, if you understand what what God is, you cannot understand truly the nature of the divine independently, autonomously of the human. The divine, the ultimate structure of the divine is Trinitarian. You have a Father and a Son. The Son is fundamentally an anthropos, who is, however, not to be understood autonomously of the divine, and so forth. So I think this is crucial. So recovering an anthropology, an understanding, and living out of the human as rooted not in a dogma, but in a telos, path of life that is itself something fundamental, something grounding even the stupidity, the perversion of our times, that it presupposes this telos. You cannot have perversions, corruptions without something integral, something whole or wholesome underneath. It could be, you could obscure that ground, you can confuse people, but
and it has to do with perfection.
It has to do with a striving for perfection, a yearning for perfection, a perfection, however, that is not the product of your yearning. It is not a fetish. It is, yeah, it is something that fundamentally is given and that sustains. So it's a matter of return. It's not a matter of progress. Not returning to the good old days only. That could just be a shadow of this fundamental sense of return. It's a question of dying. Death, again, is a return. I die every day, so I go back whence I come, to the place where we arise, whence we arise. So that is the sine qua non. Now, the without this turn, this becomes of incontournable. It cannot be. There's no alternative to this. There's no alternative if we are to escape this contemporary scene where everyone is flattered into his little corner and told that you are free only as long as you remain in your little cage, which is, of course, is absurd. You are free only if you're a slave. You want to be free? Be a slave, and then we'll give you your freedom in your cell. This is absolutely abominable, what is going on. And this has to do with the fact that people have been flattered into the situation. They've been sold a fake notion of freedom.
Yeah.
Which is uprooted.
So what's the real notion of freedom?
Well, obviously, freedom, rooted freedom, which is ultimately virtue, in the respect that it is a freedom rooted in the good. And this exercise, this going towards the good, is none other than where the good is the perfection of his going, the perfection that is given, and it somehow is rediscovered. You're always rediscovering. You're going back, going forward. You're rediscovering the origins. That is to say, the starting point, the alpha.
Okay, so let's take the conversation back to poetry and painting.
Good. Now, what does this mean for painting? Elsewhere, I have stressed this necessary dependence of painting upon logos, upon discourse, which is originally poetic, poetry. Poetry is the guide of painting. When Michelangelo is pretty old, he's no longer painting. He dedicates himself more fully to poetry. More fully because
I have his literary works here.
No, well, I do myself, yes. A fine collection over here. He has very good pieces that maybe one day we can pick up one of his
sonnets or whatever.
Sonnets, yeah, these compositions, and look at it and see what treasures it's pointing to. But he, when we speak about education, the education of a painter, how does this education articulate itself? How does it express itself? How does it manifest itself? Well, you have the teacher who tells the student, you have to do this, that, move this way, stay, even in the most basic physiological manner, stay straight and so forth. You have to consider this part and the composition and so forth. Fine. But this very often turns out to be quite mechanical approach. Looking at things from the outside, trying to get into the matter.
Well, Marco, I can, I want to say something about that and about the Bergson thing.
Okay.
But there's a famous story recounted by Gian Bologna. You know that story? Who was a student of Michelangelo.
Yeah.
And what happened to Gian Bologna with Michelangelo is what happened to me with my teacher. My teacher had the same method. So Gian Bologna recounts that he was there with Michelangelo and the students were there and he had to make some statue. I guess they were working with clay and he made this thing and he worked on it and it was beautiful. And there was an expression, I don't know what it is in Italian, but in English, it's that he finished it with his breath. Said it was perfectly done. And Michelangelo came up and he said, "That's not right." And he grabbed it and he mashed it this way and that. And he turned it into something, poor Gian Bologna was horrified because, he didn't care about this beautiful finish that he put on it. And what he did was, you might say that he expressed the inner thing about the figure, but there's another way to express it, which it might mean exactly the same thing, but I would insist on a vocabulary that has immediate practical usefulness to the student. So
yes. But here, look.
Let me finish the story.
I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So what Michelangelo did and what my teacher did with me all the time.
Yeah.
Was express the character of the movement. And the character of the movement had to do with what the model expressed. You know, if it's moving this way, I mean, something very simple, like just a figure standing with the weight on one leg, and then you have this contrapposto, and that's a movement. So, you know, the right hip is higher, the left shoulder is higher, and things like this,
Sure.
and they express what the body is doing. So, in other words, it's not just some kind of vague, you know, express the inner feeling. It's
No, it's not feeling.
so this thing, you know, whether it's a tree or a blade of grass or a person or the sky, something is being expressed that is expressed outwardly. The outward reflects the inner. So you get to the inner through the outer. There's these movements, there's these forms, there's these colors, and then by seizing a hold of those things and by using, say, the language of drawing, you know, so, for instance, to make one foot nearer than another foot, you have to put it lower on the page. So you can call that a technique if you like. But for many students, they have to be reminded of these things and shown these things to become fully aware of them, because it's drawing is a language, and it's a language you have to learn.
How do you get to the external?
Get to the external.
You say you get to the internal from the external.
Well, there it is in front of you. You have an immediate perception of it.
I don't know about that. I don't think it's immediate at all.
Well, you have to learn how to look at things in drawing terms.
Yeah, well,
and that means, you know, drawing is a language. You know, it's a sort of a natural language, you could say. It's a universal language, but it has its grammar. So things like the ultimate grammatical, or one of the ultimate grammatical things in drawing, would be a line that overlaps another line. Or then you would have these basic principles of what we call today perspective. In other words,
a perspective doesn't work in one term.
Well, I mean, very generally called perspective. I'm not talking about, you know, these perspective architectural drawings. I'm talking about, for instance, relative anything. If they're, you know, wherever the level of your eye, and then anything higher than that, you know, or lower than that, anything lower is closer. And these kinds of things. I mean, these are just the fundamental grammatical things. If you want to represent something that's in front of something else, there's a certain you know, there's a certain rhetoric of drawing that has to do with where things are placed on the page and how lines are placed down, which are, you know, these are practical matters which can be pointed out to the student, and they were pointed out to me, and that constituted my education, and also learning how to see things in such a way that they become translatable into those terms. So, I mean, you know, I had to do a certain amount of learning to get to those things.
Yes, I understand this, but okay. There's 2 points that I think are important here. One is that you could say, distinct understandings of perspective. You have medieval paintings that give you a sense of.
Well, I'm not talking about that kind of perspective. I just mean representing things that are near and things that are far. I mean, I use the word perspective just because, you know, people use that word. I mean, I think, you know, that kind of perspective, you know, I don't think it has anything to do with anything, but just I'm using it as a general term for things that are near and things that are far, and how that is represented.
Consider, for instance, Edo Japan paintings. You know, in terms of near and far, if you were to abstract rules of perspective from those paintings, they would not match.
It all functions the same way, Marco. It all functions whether it's Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Eskimo, or Western. It all functions the same way. It can be treated in different ways, and different approaches to painting can be more or less concerned about those things, but it functions in only one way, and there's only one grammar about it. You can have styles of different ways of talking about it, but there's,
I'm not quite sure. Perhaps we'll be able to discuss this on another occasion, because this becomes a more of a narrow question. Although I'm skeptical about any kind of grammar, universal grammar that can be formulated that will harmonize the perspective, Japanese, Edo, Jidai, Edo.
It doesn't harmonize it. It just, there it is.
I don't
there it is.
I don't
If you have
see
one line, if you have one line cutting off another line, this line represents, this is going behind. And that's true whether it's Hokusai drawing or whether it's Watteau or anybody or the cavemen. It's just how it is. So you don't get away from that. And things that are lower on the page, below the horizon line, or nearer, you don't get away from that. And if someone tries to do something, in contradiction to that, well, people still read it. It just becomes confused. It just works in a certain way. That doesn't mean that, if you look at old Roman paintings, I mean, they're showing the geometry of the buildings, but they're not showing it in a coherent way, the way Brunelleschi would have done, where everything's lined up the same way. They line it up any old way, but it still functions. But it's the same language. It's just more or less carried out. And also, even after the idea of perspective in the 14th or 15th century was worked out, the master painters always ignored certain of the rules of perspective, because some of those rules contradict they contradict the rhetoric of spatial representation, and the examples are very clear.
Well, okay. Perhaps we could look at some painting in the future on this subject, but suffice it now. The main. So that was the first issue that I thought was important to raise with respect to what you had said. The more important one relates to the main problem that I think is worthy of mention here, relating to your statements, is the role of language, the nature of the language of instruction. So you went to your art school and somebody was teaching you how to do something, and in what medium did they teach you? And as it turns out, our relation to what is external, I would emphasize here that it is mediated by language. So when you first said, well, the external is there, and I learned how to see the external thanks to the teacher that came to me and told me, this goes here and this goes there.
Well, it's not just language, it's also example.
Yes, okay, but even the physical example is mediated implicitly, because it's already there, it's in the background, by language. In other words, the teacher takes it for granted that you do certain things without their being mediated again by language, without his need to repeat himself. Okay. His own, when you have an example, his own movement, when he says, okay, do it this way, will be mediated by a discourse, by language.
Well, I mean, I don't want to contest that, but you know, some things were taught or could have been taught purely by the example of watching it be done. So, but
yeah, well, what I mean here is that sure, but that example itself has been mediated in its production, in its display, is the result of the agency, you know, the presence, the active presence of some kind of discourse.
no, okay, so
it's not simply an arm that is moving. There is a mind that this movement presupposes. It is the mind.
Well, but even if you're teaching this thing to yourself, I mean, you could probably say the same thing. You're trying to learn how to say represent
yes,
a form
sure,
in space, and so even if you're trying to do it yourself,
yes,
you know, you're eventually figuring out that certain, you know, you're eventually, if you will eventually discover the grammar, the rhetoric of drawing that will allow you to do this thing that you want to do.
Every aspect of painting is mediated by language. In fact, every aspect of human life is mediated by language insofar as human life at its core is linguistic. But I don't mean language in terms of, in mechanical terms, in terms of French, German, English, and so forth, Swahili. I mean language in a primordial sense, in the sense of the articulation of things in their original place. So you could say that in theological terms that the world is in the mind of God. These are all thoughts of God. But now, when the thought enters into the world, and how does it come out of the world? You could say, well, it comes out as language. So there is some kind of activity that is presupposed by the painter's activity, and that is mediating that painter's activity at every moment. And I would say that poetry is the emerging of that fundamental activity, and that represents it, and it manifests it, so that man as man is a poetic in the sense related to logos, a poetic animal, an animal whose nature is poetic, in the respect that he is that re-emerging of that breath through matter, as it were. Now, if that is the case, then every aspect, including the painter's activity, every aspect of life will be mediated by that poetry. So when you look at the teacher, you can ask yourself, how can you have a teacher who is not a poet? Is not poetry somehow the teacher par excellence of the painter?
Well, Herbie Katzman, who's one of the painters who had a great influence on me, he once said to me that painting was poetry.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that that painting equals or usurps what you're saying. I'm just, I mean, and I agree with Herbie. I mean, it's all the arts ultimately
are poetic.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
But in what sense? In the sense that they're pervaded by the presence and the agency of poetry.
Right, but yes, but poetry in the sense that this is not an objection in any way. It's I would have always said that any art is the point is poetry, to be poetic, to do something poetic. Even poetry should be poetic. Because
there's different senses of the term. Okay, sure, but in that sense, yes, life is poetic.
Again, Marco, I'm not in any way trying to object or trying to set up a different hierarchy or something. That's not at all. That's but the term, if I had to say, if the question is, what's art, what is art in its essence, and I would say that it's poetry. That you're doing something poetic, whether it's dancing or whatever it is. And if it lacks that, then and yet it's somehow art, it's failed art.
Yes.
Of whatever sort.
Okay. Yes. But this is a sense of poetry. I think that.
But you want to relate it specifically to language, so okay.
It requires unpacking. I would say that is derivative. That sense of poetry, the poetic, as opposed to crudeness and vulgarity and simply
and beautiful articulation. I mean, ultimately, there's an aspect of articulation. I mean, poetry. I mean, we always think of it as beautiful, but it's not just pure beauty. It's doing something beautifully.
Yes.
And doing something, you might say, in a way that approaches perfection.
With care.
You can't do it better. You can't,
Now, I think that this sense of poetry is presupposing, somehow is derivative, but it presupposes now, however, we do have disciplines that are, or spheres of life, as it were, that are distinct, and we can distinguish poetry as a linguistic discipline from painting, from music. And so this series of videos here was, I think, moved, I think, in great part by this desire to shed light on the distinction between poetry, painting, and music,
And to do that, you have to know something about what their actual nature is.
Yes, but that is to say the origins. You don't, you don't need to be Mozart. You don't need to be, you know, the, the greatest, Horowitz. I don't know. You don't need to be Pollini and so forth. I mean, you don't need to be a greatest virtuoso violinist
in order to
understand the nature of music. What I mean is that you need to return to a place where the human reality is integral, where in fact the seeds of music are, and whence music can develop, can spring. You need to recover the origins of. Now, can some music help you, experience with music help you return to that? Yes, but fundamentally, this is not a matter of expertise, developing an expertise in painting. Even if I were not a painter, I could, in principle, return to the ground where the seeds are. This is what I'm getting at. And how do you do that? You don't do that through a painting alone as a painter. You recognize that there is something that mediates painting, and that this element that mediates painting is represented properly by what we call, and this is now in the sense of the sphere, the discipline of poetry, that there is a linguistic, an element that needs to be rediscovered, because it is not linguistic in a crude sense of linguistic. There is a logical, in perhaps even in a sense related to Husserl, in a logical sense, so the articulation of something fundamental, the logical sense of poetry that is mediating music, that is and giving it its proper function. And then this element that will represent itself, for instance, in the sphere of poetry. And at that point, poetry as a sphere of life will interact with the sphere of painting, which will interact with the other two. So we have the interaction of spheres of life, but they're based on this logos, which is properly represented by the sphere of poetry, which is a language. How does it distinguish itself from, where does poetry go, for instance? Poetry, as a sphere of life, goes towards painting. In other words, but it doesn't reach it. It even goes beyond painting in some respect, but it does not find its fulfillment in this world, in our life. Poetry is unfulfilled. It is this movement, this articulation, but it doesn't. Now, if you want to find a fulfillment of poetry, you'd have to go for a painting. But the painting itself presupposes a movement, of course, which it conceals, because if you just look at the painting, it's done. But it presupposes a lot of work, a whole movement, a parcours. There's a whole path of struggle and struggling with matter, with material, and the inner life of things and so forth. That's the domain of painting, which ends up with somehow concealing it and exposing it at the same time. And elsewhere, I've suggested that the painter is creating a stage for poetry itself, for language, because then you interpret, poetry comes back to itself, to the original ground through painting. So I would say that there is, I think, a need to recover the proper interaction between these spheres of life rooted in a common ground where you have the seeds of these spheres, the distinction between these spheres of life. You see what I mean now?
Well, that's all quite seductive. It sounds very good, but I don't know what it means in practical terms.
In practical terms, you could say that if I am a painting teacher, everything that I will say, for instance, to my student, will be of the nature of poetry. It could be bad poetry, as in the case what I consider bad poetry, which is instruction, technical instruction uprooted from the original telos of things. So approaching things as simply being there. That's an illusion. Platonically speaking, that's an illusion. Things are not just there. It's an illusion.
Well, what about the example that I gave?
Feet here.
Well, no, how Michelangelo taught Gian Bologna and how my teacher taught me by reordering our work in closer conformity to what the movement of a figure was.
Now that's, that's fine. You are,
that's fine. I mean, that's
on the ground.
That's largely of what my education consisted.
That's groundwork. Well, but you have to see how they're actually intervening. This is not an issue that you have to give there. You have to be on the field, and I have to show you how this is modified. The image is modified, is improved upon. How the movement. I'm showing you the movement also. What it takes to get to the result. That's
and
integral to the
what it takes is understanding that something is closer and knowing that to make it closer you have to put it lower and you have to use overlapping lines in a certain way, and so that seems to me completely unobjectionable. And if the student who doesn't understand these things naturally doesn't have the benefit of that kind of teaching, they're going to have trouble. Why is that problematic?
I'm thinking in terms of, for example, proportions. Okay. Would your discussion apply to proportions?
Yes.
And
for instance, in Rubens's book about drawing the figure, he discusses how to express different kinds of figures.
Yeah.
You have to modify the proportions in different ways. If you want a Jovian figure, or the powerful, or if you want like an Apollonian figure, something more, these different kinds of characteristics. You modify the proportions and the character of different parts of the body in order to get that expression.
Sure.
So sure.
But that is not a universal. If you go, for example, in the Middle Ages, for instance, you will see these paintings where proportions of the figures are defined by the importance of the character. So,
well, I mean, there's that too. I mean, sure. I mean, the biggest figure on a canvas is generally going to be the most important one. I mean,
just as it is for children.
Yes.
But also the parts of the body and what is shown. So it has to do, but then again, it's not necessarily all that plain and simple and literal, because you might want to conceal some things that are more important than that which is shown. And it's not a linear matter.
Well, all right. I mean, but
You can go in Oriental.
I don't see how that relates to what I just said.
It relates in the respect that in Rubens' case, you have his vocabulary, his approach, his work, but which also presupposes a general understanding of the telos of his work, and ultimately of the human being. So we have a discourse of his. Now,
yeah, but except that it's universally valid.
It's valid with respect to his vocabulary and with respect to
no, with respect to how painting functions everywhere and always.
I don't think you can find some sort of practical textbook, as it were, that is valid for Rubens and
well, what Rubens points out in that book is valid everywhere and always.
It can be understood everywhere and always. It can be understood everywhere and always, but it does not.
There are painting traditions. There are painting traditions in which they don't get into those things at all, and like the Persian tradition, except that's only because they remained at a somewhat primitive stage in many respects.
I don't no. You see, I have a problem with that. This notion of primitive is all very modern to me, because the whole point of primitive is,
well, I mean, more or less. Choose another word. More or less developed. It's like a child's drawing is a natural stage. It's very symbolical, the way children draw. They draw what they're thinking in a way. The head is this round thing, the eyes are in the middle of the head, the eyes are up at the top of the head, and there are these typical things that in general children do. And then if they start learning how to draw, then it becomes more sophisticated, and eventually it becomes very sophisticated, and all the different possibilities of the language of painting start being exploited. But there are traditions in which only some of the possibilities are exploited.
I don't see this. This is mutually exclusive, because how are you going to get a Han Dynasty landscape from Rubens? Rubens has not explored that.
Okay. I mean, there's a question of styles and approaches, but there's a question of the underlying functioning of the thing, and the underlying functioning remains the same. Okay, it's a whole different stylistic approach with they're trying to capture certain things, and they do, and they're not doing other things, and there are these ways in which the different traditions have these differences. But in terms of the simple language of painting, you can compare them in another way.
It's not straightforward.
That doesn't invalidate them. It's not about that. But
my problem here is the dictionary. Okay, the problem for me is the handbook. Okay, he's got his rules. They work for him. They work for Rubens, but they're not.
It's not a question. It's not rules. It's not rules. It's just, there it is. I mean, you know, if you're going to do certain things in painting, I don't care who you are, where you are, you know, there's just this grammar to painting that has to be, you know, there it is. You can't do anything about it. It's what it is. It's like, you know, it's not whole different worlds based on another symbolical understanding of things. I mean, okay, that comes into it from a certain point of view, but from a certain basic point of view, there are these fundamentals which are just you just can't get away from them.
Yeah, well, we'd have to. This might be, you know, the subject of a discussion on its own, because you know, in the big question. Now I will go to step onto the arena of even modern philosophy. Has to do with the nature of those fundamentals. It's not that difficult to agree that they're fundamentals. The question is, what is their nature? And do we understand these fundamentals in Cartesian terms? Do we understand them in
let's be concrete.
Terms?
Well, let's be concrete. There's the overlap. This is this fundamental thing in drawing. And I don't care if you're talking about cave drawings or you're talking about, no, I don't care what you're talking about. If you have two marks on a surface and one overlaps the other, that is going to function in a certain way. It's just, you can't get away from it. You can't make the line that goes behind the other line. You can't make it go in front. It's just not going to do that. So this is
what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, if you have a line and there's another line like this line represents something that's going behind this one. It just does. It's, I mean, I demonstrated this. What?
Why not in front? Or why not?
It just doesn't. Because this, you know, there's a line here and there's another line that comes along here. I'm not showing it. Yeah. And this represents something that's behind. If it does, you know.
Why not stop there?
What do you mean stop there?
The line stops here.
Well, that you would have to do very specific things to make it clear that these things are on the same spatial level. Because as soon as you start making marks on a surface, there starts to be space that's implied. No matter how haphazard those marks are, space starts being implied.
Yes.
And the overlap is one of the basic reasons for that. And so if you wanted to have if you wanted to paint a bar that was some kind of T bar or something like that, you would have to do certain things in the painting to make it clear that this was at the same level forward and backward as this. You'd have to do certain things. Otherwise, there would be an implication of one going behind the other. Now, if it's just, a couple of lines haphazard like that, the implication is not necessarily heavy, but it can be made very heavy. For instance, if you have a landscape, you just have an open land, and there's sky and so on, and then there's a tree in the middle. That's going to be a vertical line that's interrupting the horizon line. And that vertical line of the tree is in front of the horizon line. I mean, you can draw that picture with two lines, and it will just function that way. And when you elaborate it into a tree and a horizon, you might put a little atmospheric perspective on the horizon and so on. The tree is this big bushy thing. I mean, then it becomes, you just can't get away from it. You cannot see the horizon being in front of the tree. What's representing the horizon? You can't see it in front of the horizon. You're seeing it behind that. You know that it's just on the surface, but you see it behind. And that schematically, you can reduce that to a picture like this. But it's just the functioning of the thing. It's just and that's just as true in Japanese painting as any other kind of painting. The thing that overlaps something is in front of it. You have a figure on a mountain or a tree on a mountain.
Okay, but Paul, but this reminds me of a very simple example that I used to um, give to students. I would take a sheet of paper, would fold it in two. From the center, I would tear out, let's say, even a half a circle. So it turns out there's a hole in the middle when you open up the sheet again. And then I would say, look, wherever you place this sheet, you see a round shape. The round shape is everywhere. And, you know, you have Marxists who see their thing everywhere. You have Freudians who see their thing everywhere. They have drawn their circle. They have drawn their shape and they superimpose it over everything and they see it everywhere and they say, hey, it's universal. You just gave me a discourse about lines that is extremely articulate, no matter how simple you want to make it look like. You know, you understand what I mean? It's extremely articulate. Now, you can go back to the point because we have fundamental notions such as being, the point, right, and order. 3 fundamental notions we have to make up the world for ourselves. But you see, this is all artificial. It is the product of the mind that articulates things that way. But this does not tell me it cannot articulate things in another way.
You can't articulate things another way when it comes to this business of overlaps.
Well, look, I mean,
that it doesn't have to do with what we think. It has to do with our visual experience.
okay, but I can conceive of a different type of visual experience. I don't know, but I mean,
it's rooted.
I don't have a problem with there being a different visual experience. As far as I'm concerned, maybe what you're saying.
I do. There's we have binocular vision and we are ambulatory creatures. And therefore, there are fundamentals of our visual experience, which are just that they're just what they are. Then you could see, well, people, you know, they live in on some desert island, or they live here, so they're seeing different sorts of things. But the fundamental
is this fundamental? I'm trying to get to something fundamental. This, for me, is extremely narrow. How should I put it? It is a
very... okay, Marco. For you, it's not fundamental, and I'm interested to hear what you think is fundamental, and then you know, and I'm interested to hear how, from whatever it is that you think is fundamental, one can then arrive at making beautiful paintings
without ever having to bother even with considerations that may be valid, may be applicable everywhere for human beings, such as what you just mentioned. I don't have a problem with that consideration. I have a problem with considering it as part and parcel of a fundamental dictionary, as it were, for everyone. I might be a great painter without ever once having considered what you just said.
Well, you've got to deal with it, whether you consider it or not.
I could deal with it. I'm not thinking about it in those terms. I'm not even bothering with it. I'm gonna.
No, I don't. Fine, but I'm you're gonna need to back that up, because I can't think of anything in all of painting from any time or anywhere where those things are not operant.
Maybe they're operant in some sense, but I'm not thinking about
in a fundamental sense. I mean, in the sense where if space and volume is being expressed, they're being expressed because those things are understood and manipulated. And without that, it just isn't happening, or it's happening in a weak way.